I never thought this day would come. Okay, I'll stop being dramatic. For the longest time, the dream of Toronto Transit users and enthusiasts has been all-day service on the Milton GO line. For context, the Milton line might be better known as the Mississauga line, since it spends a substantial portion of its length, and more than any other GO line, within the city of Mississauga, which is the 6th largest in Canada. There are roughly 750,000 people who live in Mississauga. Now, Mississauga is a massive business and logistics hub, and it's also a major population center, with numerous businesses and people moving there to avoid the high prices of Toronto while still being located in the Greater Toronto area. Now, the Milton Line passenger rail service wouldn't exist at all if it weren't for the famous 1979 CP rail derailment. A CP train derailed on CP's main line through Mississauga, causing a number of hazardous chemical rail cars to light on fire and obviously derail and crash. Now, this led to a massive evacuation as well as a number of rail safety changes across North America. But what it also led to was CP, who had previously been opposed to passenger rail service on its main line through Mississauga, allowing passenger rail service as a condition of the city of Mississauga dropping a lawsuit against it. All that allowed service to be established in 1981 on the Milton Line. Now, that said, while the Milton Line is incredibly well located within Mississauga, serving areas like Arundel, Erin Mills, Cooksville, Dixie, as well as Western Toronto and Milton, of course, while CP did allow the establishment of a number of initial peak service trains, they have not really allowed Metrolinx to substantially increase service on the Milton Line and provide the sort of all-day service that you're seeing on the various other lines on the GO system. Of course, this is despite the incredibly high passenger transportation value on the line and the fact that it connects Canada's biggest city to Canada's 6th biggest city. That means to this day, the line only sees a few inbound trains in the morning and a few outbound trains in the evening. Despite all of this, the Milton Line is one of the best utilized GO lines, and despite having less service than other lines on the network, it actually has more ridership. Now, for years and years, while plans were established to electrify and improve service on Toronto's other regional rail lines, the Milton Line has sort of felt like the odd one out. There's been little service improvement, and that's despite the Milton Line's average station having more ridership than some of the least used stations on the Toronto subway system. So they're very popular despite offering limited services every day and being located in suburban areas. And many Toronto rail infrastructure fans' dream is the missing link. The missing link would be a rail link that allowed another route across Peel region, likely for both CN and CP, along the Highway 407 corridor. This would have not only allowed most CN trains to not use the GO Kitchener corridor, but it would also mean most CP trains don't need to use the GO Milton corridor. That wouldn't just enable frequent all-day service on the Milton Line, but it would also open up the Midtown Toronto corridor, which would allow some GO services to terminate north of downtown Toronto, spreading the load and just opening up so many new service possibilities. Of course, that would also enable a ton of new transit service at a relatively small cost. The Toronto Regional Board of Trade even proposed that if such a thing were to happen, that the Milton Line could be realigned via a tunnel through Mississauga city centre, allowing a downtown to downtown rail link between Toronto and Mississauga. However, Metrolinx's new CEO, who's been around for a few years, Phil Verster, who I talked to on the channel in the past, came into the role, he essentially said the missing link isn't needed and we're going to create more rail service without it. That was of course to the horror of many rail fans and transit enthusiasts and some transit planners in the region. But this was justified by saying that the missing link was expensive and hard to execute, and that more service could be born out of simply negotiating with the freight railways. Now, this is something that sounded incredibly worrisome a few years ago when we first told it. Traditionally, North American freight railways have not gone along with passenger services, because the freight operators don't typically operate in a way which is compatible with passenger traffic. Furthermore, past attempts to come to agreements for additional service typically left infrastructure constructed and then used by the freight companies and no more service for passenger trains. However, today's announcement, which I'll now get to, thanks for staying with me, helps to alleviate a lot of these concerns, and it's made me much more optimistic. Today's announcement actually came from the federal government, which is the first positive sign here. The federal government has a lot more power than the province with regards to transportation and is actually the regulator for the freight railways. Furthermore, the new federal Minister of Transportation, who made this announcement as well as the Via HFR announcement a few weeks ago, is from Mississauga Centre, so the stars seem to have aligned. Now, the announcement itself was that the federal government is willing to spend up to 50% of the cost of infrastructure to enable two-way all-day GO service on the Milton corridor, up to $500 million. Now, that amount of money won't excite any missing link revivalists, but it is enough money when combined with another $500 million or more from the province, who could easily chip in that amount of money, especially for the important swing ridings in the 905 region surrounding Toronto, could enable a lot of track improvements, perhaps a few grade separations, probably not a rail-rail grade separation, but maybe, as well as perhaps some station changes to allow for more platforms to be built. Now, you might be wondering, is there really a case for this? A transit agency builds freight railway more infrastructure on their corridor, and then transit agency is allowed to operate more service by the freight operator? And the answer is yes, definitely. In fact, the recently started West Harbour GO to Toronto, Hamilton, Toronto hourly GO train service does exactly this. Metrolinx went in and around Bayview Junction and around West Harbour Station added some additional tracks which made CN comfortable, allowing Metrolinx to operate an hourly service despite the fact that it's over their territory. There will be a video coming on that tomorrow, so stay tuned. Metrolinx is also working with CN to enable some sort of all-day service on the Kitchener corridor, where again it will be traveling through CN's territory. Of course, there's also the case of the Lakeshore East line east of Toronto, which operates in Durham region and has Metrolinx operating GO tracks in the same corridor as CN but isolated, allowing trains up to every 15 minutes as of late to operate directly next to the freight line. So clearly, if higher frequencies are needed, there are options for that as well. Now, how could more service be made to work? Well, as it turns out, the Milton line doesn't have all that many industries from Milton to where it connects with the rest of the GO network just north of Bloor-Dundas West Station. And as it seems more and more of these are shutting down as land is redeveloped in these valuable areas, it seems like there might be fewer and fewer into the future. Unfortunately though, those industries are on both the north and south side of the corridor, so things are a bit more complicated. You can't, for example, add tracks on one side of the corridor and say, there's basically isolation now, we can operate frequent trains for GO. Of course, there's also a decent amount of through traffic through Mississauga and then through into Toronto, where there is the CP Toronto yard. Keeping all that in mind though, there is a lot of track in the corridor, and it seems like it would be possible, especially if more track is added, to operate one track at any time dedicated to GO, which would enable hourly or perhaps even half-hourly service if some passing tracks and other things are incorporated. Now, if you're wondering why I suggested more platforms in the past, having more platforms and platforms on as many tracks as possible just allows for more flexibility. If on one day, for example, one track needs to be used for a ton of freight service, well, GO can operate on other tracks and vice versa. You can sort of shift around the traffic to still have passengers able to access the trains while offering CP its flexibility. Of course, industries, while important, don't often get deliveries all that often, and at the same time, through traffic, while it is significant, is actually not that high in raw numbers, so as long as there's some flexibility built in, a lot could actually happen. Of course, there's another major thing in recent years that's made me optimistic here, and it's the fact that we're now able to take train designs from other parts of the world and use them here. That means you could see more flexible options, like for example battery trains that operate the last leg of the trip from Burlington into West Harbour, or in the case of the Milton line, dual mode trains which are able to operate on electricity south of Bloor-Dundas West and then on diesel for the rest of the route, or perhaps battery in the future. These could be modern multiple unit trains, and so it's very exciting to see where this goes in tandem with the GO RER project, which is really about the frequent electrified service. Of course, there's also a broader story here, which is that with increasing negotiations happening with the freight railways, in the case of things like via HFR, potential rail service to Banff, this project, and other projects around the country, there's more and more potential to interoperate passenger and freight service, and not bad passenger service, but good passenger service. I think an hourly service in a lot of places in the country could be fantastic, and it would open up rail services in places like Halifax, and more service in Vancouver, and Montreal, and perhaps Calgary and Edmonton. And so if we're able to figure out models for interoperating with the freight railways and governance models so that the agencies that are operating public transit can say, we can build some infrastructure, you can allow for some more service, there is so much potential to increase rail service across Canada, especially in smaller areas where a couple DMUs could be picked up and short interregional routes or rural routes could be operated. There is a lot of amazing stuff that could happen, and so it's just exciting to see these models being worked out. I also think that while I love the idea of a missing link, and it's something I would like to see in the long term, that this is a great first step. even an hourly service could be surprisingly attractive, especially as problems like climate change become larger and things like carbon pricing and more restrictive auto licensing become issues and people start considering public transit as an option more often. Hourly service is pretty awesome. You plan around a little, but if it's consistent, it's great. Of course, in addition, once you have that hourly service, you get people riding, and then you have more people advocating for more frequent service. And as we've seen, there's no reason you couldn't do some grade separations and add more tracks and do more expensive work, like we've seen in many of GO's other corridors, to create truly segregated tracks for GO, allowing them to operate a frequent all-day service and maybe even electrify eventually. So in short, it seems like one of the most important passenger rail corridors in the Toronto region, one that has got a ton of new connectivity options being built, as well as new station upgrades and the like, is finally going to see its ridership unconstrained. And it might even see some fairly frequent all-day train service. Even if hourly, more train service on the Milton line would make commuting so much more practical, and would mean that people could take midday and evening trips to downtown Toronto and other places throughout the region, connecting with other new GO and TTC and other services. This is all super exciting to me, and it feels like the next step, building not just beyond GO RER, but layering on top of it. And I am super excited. Thanks for watching.